I am Johanna Vuori, and I wish you warmly welcome to our spring seminar. It is my great pleasure to see all of you, and on behalf of Leading Passion Project Group, I hope that you enjoy your morning session. Leading Passion is a research project where we study leadership practices that encourage creation of cultures of engagement and passionate work. We also study the attitudes of young people at work. We have researchers from Aalto University, Filosofian Akatemia, and Haga-Helia. And if I just might ask our researchers and projects team to stand up and greet you. Today we have 4 speakers, and after 2 speakers we have a break for refreshments. Our seminar will be live streamed, and all the materials and video lectures will be found on our website www.leadingpassion.fi next week. You are encouraged to tweet, and after presentations, I take questions from the audience, and if we have time, also from the tweet fall. After the first presentation, we switch into Finnish language, and you can also ask your questions in Finnish or English if you like to. We are working together with 4 companies or organizations: Suomen Economit, Santander Consumer Finance, Pipeline Finland, and Clear Channel Finland Limited. We are all represented here, and we have a speaker who is the chairperson of our steering group, Kimmo Kedonpää from Pipeline Finland. Our project is for 3 years and funded by all the partners and Finnish Innovation Fund, Tekes. When we started the research proposal last September, we had 2 dreams. One was to invite Richard Ryan to Finland and talk about self-determination theory. The second dream was to rent an auditorium and invite so many guests as possible to listen to him. Both dreams came true today. You are here, Richard Ryan is here, and I believe this has been a dream of Alvar Aalto too when he designed this beautiful auditorium. I'm sure he would love to see engaged scholars and practitioners sharing insights and learning something together. Richard Ryan is the creator of self-determination theory together with Professor Edward Deci. Richard Ryan works at University of Rochester in New York as a professor of psychology. He has also a professorship at Australian Catholic University. He has more than 250 scientific publications and has given keynotes and other presentations in more than 80 universities around the world. Today he is in Finland, in Espoo, with us. We welcome Professor Richard Ryan.
Joanna, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here in Finland. I would first like to apologize that I don't speak any Finnish. I probably haven't learned maybe 3 words so far in my 3 days here, so I appreciate your tolerance of my speaking in English. I'd also like to thank Frank Martella, who's been my host and the person who I met who invited me to come here. We have a beautiful collaboration together and have been writing some good articles, and I'm really happy to be working with him. Today, my interest is to give you a brief introduction to self-determination theory, but before doing so, I want to say that all the work I do in self-determination theory is collaborative work. We have a community of scholars around the world who meet every 3 years to advance this work, and I put up on the board here a few of the people whose work with me I'm going to mention today. Again, there's last international conference for SDT, there were representations from 39 countries around the world. It's a growing framework for studying many interesting topics in psychology. The work that I do in self-determination theory really began with Ed Deci in the 1970s, which tells you how old I am. We were working on a topic we called intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation I'll talk about at length today, but it's the things we do because they interest us. The behavior itself interests us. And we were interested in what things would lead to its being sustained and what things would undermine it. But then our work quickly led us to be more interested in extrinsic motivation and the various ways people can do things that are not interesting, but maybe still do them quite willingly and with a lot of enthusiasm. And that led us to many, many other topics, because as we investigated the conditions under which people are most motivated, we also saw that these were related to people's wellness and to the functioning of organizations and to leadership styles and many other topics of great interest to us. And I won't be able to talk about many of our research areas in today's very brief talk. For me, an hour talk is a very short talk, and it makes me very anxious. But I will try and cover at least the things that are here in red. And on Friday, I'll be speaking about some of the other basic topics at this university. We've applied SDT in many different areas, and I know that there's much interest in this room in organizational psychology, but I'm going to introduce a few different applied areas in the talk today just to show the generality of these principles of motivation. I want to say that because the talk is brief, I'm going to give what we would call, in the US, a bird's eye view. So this is a view of Helsinki, and if I were a bird flying over Helsinki, I wouldn't know much about Helsinki just from this one view of it. And I suspect that by the end of my 1 hour talk, you'll know as much about self-determination theory as this bird knows about Helsinki. But anyway, I try to give some of the basic tenets clearly. I want to say just one thing about myself before we begin, which is that my own background is as a clinical psychologist. I've been a trainer of psychotherapists and a head of a clinic for at the clinical training program at Rochester for 30-some years, although now I'm at Australia at the Institute for Positive Psychology. Although I began my career wanting only to be a clinician, I saw right away that principles of motivation were very important to people's well-being, and research on them was also very crucial, so I took some different paths in life. Now, not only do I do this research with positive psychology, but also I founded a company with Scott Rigby some 15 years ago where we apply many of the techniques that I'll be talking about today, because I think these techniques are very applicable, so I'm hoping that there's some people in the audience who find useful some of the things I talk about. The main central topic for self-determination theory is the idea of motivation. And everybody in this room knows what the term motivation means. It means to be moved to act in some way or another. But I think without even thinking deeply about it, we know that we can be moved to act by many different things. We could be moved to act because somebody forces us or coerces us into action, in which case we might comply, but the quality of our behavior will be very low and our experience will be low. We can be moved into action because someone dangles a carrot or a big reward before us, and then we seek the carrot and take whatever route we can to the end of that. We can also be moved into action because we're deeply inspired by an idea or a cause. Or we can be moved into action even because we find something interesting and we're just curious about it. All of these are forces of motivation. And a central idea in self-determination theory is it's not just how motivated we are, but what is motivating us that makes the biggest difference in terms of the quality of our behavior. Now, when I grew up in the field of psychology, this was the view of motivation that was the dominant view of motivation. And I will argue with you today that this is a very convincing and correct view of motivation under the conditions in which it was studied. So the Skinnerians and the operant behaviorists that I worked with when I was young knew that if you had an organism and you had control over its environment and the rewards and punishments that could befall it, you could control a lot of that organism's behavior. Not everything, but you could make it do almost anything you wanted it to do. And I think this, as I say, is a correct theory, but only under the conditions that it meets. The problem with the theory is not that it's wrong, it's that it doesn't apply, because in our human life, if I'm in a cage, if I'm in your organizational cage and you're applying certain contingencies of reward or punishment to me, and I don't like it, I can leave the cage. If I'm a child in a classroom and the teacher is using motivational techniques that don't fit with my soul, I can disengage and get on my website or get on my smartphone. I can find a lot of ways to walk out of the cage. And so the problem with this theory is not that it's wrong, it's that people have choices. And they will not stay with contingencies of reinforcement that are not fitting for them. And so the field of motivation has changed dramatically over time. We say there's been a Copernican turn in the field of motivation in the last 30 years, not just because of self-determination theory, but really all of the major theorists have understood that the problem is not so much how to control people from the outside, but how can we understand what motivates people from within, and how can we help sustain them on that inner motivation when they make good choices. So this has been a real change in the way that we think about motivation, because it's really about why people choose what they do, and how can we facilitate them staying on course and being engaged in that. Excuse me for a minute. I get very anxious talking in front of people, so I need my water. So in the bird's eye view idea of self-determination theory, this is the broadest view I can give you, which is we argue that there are some basic psychological needs that everybody has, everybody in this room has, everybody in this world has. And when these needs are met, people are most optimally motivated, and they're also at their peak in terms of wellness and experience. And when any of these needs are thwarted or interfered with in a workplace, in a schoolroom, on a sport field, in a parenting environment, in any of these areas, then there's some loss and degradation in the way in which humans function. Now, I'm going to go into these three needs in a minute, but because we have a very strong definition of need, we only have three. Frank Martello, who's working with me, he keeps nominating a fourth one that we're arguing about continuously. We've always argued about how many there are. He's had the most convincing argument so far, but I'm not even going to mention the fourth in this talk. So a need, the way we see need, is something that's essential to an organism's well-being, to its growth, and to its integrity. But I want to say, the word need is an ambiguous term. We use the term need in the US in many ways. I could say, I need a new Xbox, or I need 3 more TVs in my house, or I need a new set of guns. That would be something we'd want in the US. That I could say I need these things, but really what that would show is that I have a preference or a desire for something. We're not using the word need in that way. We're using the word need as the idea of necessity again for something's growth and well-being. We know there are physical needs of organisms. We know, for instance, that people need certain vitamins. They need vitamin C. If they don't get vitamin C, they get diseases like scurvy, as Captain Cook discovered. So when we think about these things, we say, well, it doesn't matter whether I like vitamin C. It doesn't matter whether I prefer it or like it. If I don't get it, I show some functional problems that will result from it. And SDT argues that the psyche, the human psyche in its development, also has these fundamental needs. And it doesn't matter whether you value them. It doesn't matter whether your culture values them. If they're not received, then there'll be downsides and there'll be detectable deterioration in the way in which people function. And I just give an example of this. I'm a clinician. We say there's a basic need for relatedness, but many clients might come to me and say, I want no more intimate relationships in my life. I'm done with those. And I believe them because that means they've been hurt or burned or somehow in conflict in the past and they don't want to suffer that again. But I know as a clinician, if we don't find a way for them to find a pathway to intimacy again, they will not be well in their life. Similarly, we've been doing work in southern Israel in recent years, and I've had the chance to interview Bedouin women, and many Bedouin women will say to me, we don't need any choice, we don't need any control, it's okay that others make decisions, but nonetheless we think that the absence of control and choice in life has ramifications for health and for well-being, regardless of it being culturally fitting. There are many things as well, I'll go through in America too, where people's values for materialism and for achievement get in the way of these basic needs, and it doesn't matter that their values are very strong. If these needs are not met, people will show deterioration. And so I want to say some things about these needs after I get a drink. The first need is the need for relatedness. And it's the sense that we need a sense of, in any organization where we're working or a classroom that we're in, we need to feel like we matter, that we're a significant human being in that atmosphere, that we belong, and that we're connected to the other people that are there. The second fundamental need is the need for competence. We can't be motivated, we can't be well unless we feel that we have some mastery, some efficacy about the things that are really important to us in life. This is probably the least controversial aspect of SDT, because every theory of motivation argues that you need to have some essential need for, or essential feeling of mastery in order to be motivated to act. The third need here is the need for autonomy, and I'm going to spend just a minute speaking about it because it's perhaps the most controversial, yet most central to our work. For us, the idea of autonomy is that when you're doing something, you agree with what you're doing. You would endorse what you're doing. When you're acting, you feel willing to act in the way that you are, or what we would say you're being volitional. You feel voluntary in what you're doing. The opposite of autonomy is that you feel controlled. We call it heteronomy. So when you're controlled, you feel like something's imposed on you, or you're made to do something that may not fit with your interests or does not fit with your values. So given that, I want to say that there's some ideas that autonomy is not equivalent to. It's not the same as independence. So for us in our theorizing, when you're independent, you're not relying on anybody else for help or for goods or for guidance. But you can be, in our view, autonomously dependent. So you can be willingly going to other people for guidance, going to other people for help. When I go to my doctor and I'm sick, I say to her, please heal me, because I don't know how. I'm being volitionally, autonomously dependent in that moment. And when my children were teenagers, they're in their 20s now, late 20s now, but when they were teenagers, they would come to me and say, Dad, I'd like some advice or some guidance. I would like some money, whatever it was that they were asking for. They were being, in those moments, volitionally dependent, autonomously coming to me for help. And in fact, we show in our research that the most healthy adolescents are not those who are independent of their parents. That's not the trajectory of development. It's those who stay close to their parents and still rely on them volitionally for help and for guidance. And as I won't be able to go into today, the reason that children don't depend on their parents is because their parents become controlling or need thwarting in terms of relatedness, and children draw away, and then they get their guidance from the people that they are close to. So it's not the same as independence. It's also not the same as individualism or collectivism. I've worked in many different countries, some collectivistic, some individualistic. You can be autonomously collectivistic if you really believe in the values of collectivism. And in fact, I've met many people who this is their abiding, heartfelt values is the care and concern for the collective or the group over the individual. This is very autonomous for many people. In fact, our research shows it's harder to be autonomously individualistic than it is to be autonomously collectivistic. But I also worked in Bulgaria in the late 1980s and early 90s. And in Bulgaria at that time, there was a collectivistic arrangement, but for many people it was not autonomous at all. It was forced upon them. So you can have both heteronomous or controlled collectivism, or you can have autonomous collectivism. Again, it's not this equivalent idea. It's also not the case that when you're autonomous, you're not following anybody else's direction. If I were on the way here this morning, as I was with Frank, and we were stopped by police because there was an accident in the road, and they said, you stop right now, I would autonomously stop for the police person. And why? Because I believe in the value of the traffic laws, and I believe in the legitimacy of that authority. But on the other hand, some authorities might tell me to do something and I don't concur with it, or I don't agree with their legitimacy to tell me what to do. And in that case, even if I follow the command, I would not do so autonomously. I would not feel volitional in doing it. And many of our leadership styles have us following commands that we don't autonomously concur with. And finally, for us, autonomy is not the same as freedom. We use the term freedom to refer to the absence of constraints. But I could have no constraints on me, but I could have no idea of what I would like to voluntarily do. I might have no guidance or pathway. I would have no structure to know what to choose. So the fact of being not constrained does not in any way support or guarantee autonomy. It may remove some obstacles to autonomy, but it never supplies the full grounds for this to happen. So that said, I want to argue that autonomy is very important for wellness and for people's motivation and engagement in any sphere. And I'm going to talk about two types of autonomous motivation. The first one is where we started with our research, which is the idea of intrinsic motivation, when you do something because it's interesting or challenging and fun in its own right. And then the other kind of volitional motivation is not when something's fun or interesting to do, but rather because you really value that activity and you're fully willing to commit to it. And there are multiple ways to support these forms of volition, and there's also lots of ways to undermine them. So I'm going to begin with intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, as I said, is when you do something for its own sake, just because you find the activity interesting. The example I like here is this child up in the corner who's playing in the sandbox. He's entirely wrapped up in this activity, and no one has to give him a reward to do it. No one has to threaten him with punishment to play in the sand. He's doing this just because he enjoys the activity itself. This activity is very important for him. All play in children is very important because it's part of their neuropsychological development. He's learning motor skills. He's learning about the physics of the world. He's learning about probably social relationships in the sandbox. There's much learning going on while he's playing. But if we went up to him and we said to him, you know, this is good for your brain, he would probably find it less interesting and he would find us odd. Another thing we would do is if we went up to try and reward him for playing in the sandbox, we said, I'm going to give you 10 euros if you keep playing in the sandbox. He would like that maybe if he's old enough to understand that he can buy something with it. And at the same time, he might now play less in the sandbox because he would be waiting for us to give him 10 euros to do so. And I'll show some evidence to that effect. But my point is that children's play doesn't need to be externally motivated. It's part of the engine that evolution has already provided us to discover, to be curious, to learn about the world around us. And it's one of the most powerful fuels of engagement and learning across the lifespan, not just in childhood, but hopefully all of us have a lot of intrinsic motivation. Like I read the papers every day wherever I go. I can't read them here. They're not in English. But if they were, I would be reading them here. I read a couple papers a day, not because I get paid for doing so or rewards. I'm just curious about what's going on in the world. That's intrinsic motivation. Learning is happening, and it's hopefully something that everybody finds areas in life where they do it. Sports is a big area for people, games, puzzles, other things, sometimes entertainment. It's a big part of life. When we looked at what sustains, I want to say one more thing about that, which is when children come into school, in elementary school, they have a high degree of intrinsic motivation for learning. They want to learn and they're curious about learning. And the sad thing that we see in most countries that I've studied, and there's been several now, we see a downward trend in intrinsic motivation across the school years, beginning in first grade and ending up in a very low trough by 10th grade of school. And this is common across nations. And it has a couple of major dips in it that are predictable from developmental perspectives. But largely it's because of the way in which we've decided that we're not going to harness the evolutionarily supplied intrinsic motivation technique of learning. We're going to supply another technique of learning, which is grades, controls, pressures, and tests. And so we should not be surprised when we see the evidence about what supports intrinsic motivation, that it wanes over the years of schooling, and we lose the engagement of so many children in schools. So in our very simple theory and this was our earliest theory called cognitive evaluation theory, we argued that for intrinsic motivation to happen, one should be in a safe and secure relationship environment. But the two most maximal variables predicting intrinsic motivation are that you would feel efficacy or mastery in the area that you're engaged. And the second thing is that you would feel autonomy in the area you're engaged. Anything that makes you feel less competent will decrease your intrinsic motivation. Anything that increases feelings of competence will enhance intrinsic motivation. Anything that interferes with the feeling of volition and autonomy will lead to undermining of intrinsic motivation. Anything that increases your sense that this is my activity, I'm initiating this, and I am voluntarily doing this will enhance intrinsic motivation. Now, how do we know this? We've done lots of experiments. We do many of them are laboratory experiments, and I'm going to tell you a bit about how a typical experiment would work. We might bring a person into the room. Let's say I bring this young woman who's sitting in the front here into a laboratory setting, and we're going to expose her to some puzzles or some interesting literature or something that would be highly interesting to her. And we know this because we will pilot things to make sure they're interesting in the first place to most people. And then we might put her under one of two conditions. In one condition, she would come in and we would say, this is the absence of pressure condition. We might say, you know, these are some tasks, experimental tasks that we're trying out in the lab. They're for you to do over the next 10 minutes. Do the best you can on them. And then that would be it. In the second condition, we might come in, we might say exactly the same things to her, but we would add at the end of it, but we want you to live up to standards and we hope that you will excel in your performance at this task. So we're putting some interpersonal pressure on her to do really well at this task. We assume that the interpersonal pressure leads her to feel like we're controlling her activity rather than she's controlling her activity. And as it turns out, that pressure condition will lead her to be less interested in the activities subsequently. And we know this in the following way. We finish the experiment, we tell her we're done, it's over, but we need you to stay here in the room for the next 10 minutes while we go to get the paperwork, or we always have an excuse for why we leave. And then let's say that she was doing a puzzle, we leave the puzzles on the table, and we have magazines and other things, and we say to her, you know, during the 10 minutes you can do whatever you like. You can continue with these puzzles, there's more of them to do, or you can read magazines or just sit, but wait here for 10 minutes. And then in the old days, I would walk around a wall, and there would be a small hole in the wall, and I would watch her very closely, and I would see if she went back to the activity that was the target activity. Now, she thinks she's not being watched, she thinks she's under no pressure, she thinks there's no evaluation going on, so if she goes back to the activity, it would typically be out of interest in the activity. She's still engaged in the activity, and we time how much time she spends on this, and we call this the free choice behavior measure of intrinsic motivation, and it's the gold standard in experimental work in this area. And so what we would find is after putting her under a little bit of interpersonal pressure, she's less likely to turn back to that task as soon as we leave the room. She'll probably go read the magazines. But if we haven't put her under pressure and she's been able to maintain interest in it, she'll want to continue doing those, and then we'll see that she has a higher rate of behavior. Usually then we'll also follow this up afterwards by asking about her interest and her enjoyment of activities, and that usually matches the behavior measure. So across many experiments, we look at conditions that enhance or undermine intrinsic motivation. So for instance, and I just list some of them up there, we might give people a choice over how they go about doing a task. This enhances their intrinsic motivation, or now give them choice over the strategy in which that they use to tackle a task. And that will enhance intrinsic motivation. But if I tell somebody this is the goal that you will have here, or this is the strategy you must use in this task, their intrinsic motivation is diminished as a result of that external feeling of control that undermines autonomy. Even like we would set a deadline on people saying, you know, you need to finish this within the next 15 minutes. And we know the task only takes 8. So the deadline is not an interference with performance, but the very fact of setting the deadline says, I'm the one who's in control of your activity here, and that diminishes intrinsic motivation. Anything that conveys that I'm the one who's controlling you in this situation will undermine intrinsic motivation. Even watching somebody closely over their shoulder will lead them to have lower intrinsic motivation. Similarly, if you give people problems that are too easy, kind of boring, or that are way too difficult for them so that they can't feel any sense of competence or growth in it, they are less interested in the activity subsequently. But if you give people things that they can feel a lot of mastery over and where they can get positive feedback, their intrinsic motivation keeps going up for this. And finally, in atmospheres where you treat people in cold or non-empathic manners, you see low intrinsic motivation. If you treat people warmly and empathically, then intrinsic motivation is likely to be higher in any setting. So these experimental findings have been very consistent across time. Perhaps the most controversial one has been the one about rewards, because early on, and it was particularly my colleague Ed Deasy who made this early discovery, which is that when you reward people for doing something that's intrinsically motivated, while they like getting the reward, they're less intrinsically motivated subsequently for doing it, particularly depending on how you've given people the reward. We say, when you give a reward in a way that says, I will give you this reward if you do this, which means I'm the one who's motivating you to do this, this will diminish intrinsic motivation. It's been a very controversial issue in the field, and I'm gonna put up a lot of numbers here. And by the way, there's a lot of numbers today. I don't expect all of you to follow those. I put them up just for those who want to. But this is a meta-analysis that was done in 1999. We're just now doing a new one because there's now double this number of studies. But at that time, there were 101 experiments in the literature testing this undermining effect of reward on intrinsic motivation. And across those 101 studies, you can see at the top here, it says a D of -24. That's an effect size. It means that there's a weak negative effect of all rewards types on intrinsic motivation. But we don't think all rewards undermine intrinsic motivation, only the ones that feel like they're controlling you. And so if you go down underneath all rewards, the next level is that some rewards are tangible and financial, and those have a little bit bigger D, -34, I think it is. That means that they're a little more likely to undermine intrinsic motivation. Because typically the reason we give money or tangible objects to people is because we're trying to motivate them to do something from the outside. On the other hand, verbal rewards, the things in the literature that are called verbal rewards, we would mostly in lay language call praise. So if I say you did a good job at that, that's called a verbal reward, but really it's competence feedback. And we think it mostly enhances intrinsic motivation. And you see here that there's a positive effect of verbal rewards on intrinsic motivation. Praising people enhances a sense of competence and doesn't undermine their motivation. Now I will let you note here that there's two types of experiments where these praising studies have been done. Some is with college students, and when you praise college students on their performance at anything, they believe you, and therefore their competence feelings are enhanced. Children, on the other hand, we praise children a lot, and it can undermine their intrinsic motivation as well as improve it. And why is that? It has a lot to do with the way in which we use praise often with children. Often we use praise to control them. I say, good girl, I like the way you're taking notes here in this class. That's really trying to say, I want you to take more notes, and I want the others to see that that's what they're supposed to do. It's a very controlling form of praise, and it undermines intrinsic motivation. I will say we also get gender differences, sex differences in our studies about the use of praise. When you praise men, they always believe you. They think they're more competent. When you praise women, they think, what are you up to? So they can be undermined by praise. You have to be much more careful praising women. I've learned this over the years. My wife has taught me very well about this. Underneath tangible rewards, you can see expected rewards, the ones where I say, if you do this, I will give you this. Those are the ones that undermine. But unexpected rewards typically don't undermine. If you've done a great job on something, I say, I so appreciate what you've done. You know, here's an extra bonus, or here's a big reward for having done so. I want to show you my appreciation. That's not undermining of motivation because it wasn't controlling your behavior in the first place. So there's no negative effect of unexpected rewards. It's those that are used intentionally to control the other person's behavior. There are many other nuances to the reward effect, but I just want to show you a couple examples of it. This is not my study, but I just like it. It comes from two researchers at the Max Planck Institute. Oh my gosh. At the Max Planck Institute, where they're looking at children, and they were trying to argue that children's helpfulness, their altruism, is intrinsically motivated. And they show that children at a high rate will help strangers. If strangers drop something when they walk in a room, children will pick it up. If something's out of reach, children will help. At a rate of about 90% of the time, children will help. So then they put children under some conditions. In one condition, they just did nothing when children helped. In another condition, they praised them. They said, that was very nice, thank you. In a third condition, they gave them a reward every time they helped somebody in the laboratory. And then some time passed, and then they brought the children back in the laboratory and they gave them a series of opportunities to help again. And what they found is in the neutral condition where nothing had been done, children still helped at a 90% rate, or 89% rate. And when they praised them, because of the nature of the praise was not controlling, they still helped at a very high rate. But those who had been rewarded for helping helped less frequently now than if they had never been rewarded at all. And I suspect that those kids were like, I don't see any reward coming here. Why should I help? So something that was already natural to them was undermined by now taking it over from the environment and controlling it from the outside. There's other ways to show this. This is a study with Ko Murayama. Ko invented a game that you could play inside of an fMRI that was kind of fun. That was pretty unusual in its own right. And what he was, so it was a little stopwatch game. And then in the first condition, he said to people when they came in, there's extra money that we got in this experiment, so we're going to give it to you in terms of bonuses for a good performance on this game. So every time you get a good shot in this game, we're going to give you a financial reward. And the other group was not told anything about bonuses. And this is a slice of the brain called the bilateral striatum, and this is the area of our brain where we're very sensitive to reward effects in our environment. And you can see in this session 1, the red bar that's over here, people who are getting financial rewards, they're very activated in this reward area of the brain. But also note that there's a blue bar there. That's the condition where people aren't getting any rewards, and they're also active in this reward area because they're finding this activity mildly interesting. They think it's kind of rewarding in its own right. In the second session, they come back, and of course there's not this extra money that's around, so nobody's getting any rewards in the second session. And if this were just extinction in the behavior sense, then what would happen is the red bar would drop to the level of the blue bar. But it doesn't. You see now that people who were previously getting rewards are not finding this activity rewarding at all. There's very little reward activation in that part of the brain. Whereas the people who never got rewards are still finding this rewarding to do. They're still engaged in the task, and this is shown by the lateral prefrontal cortical slice that I put up here now, which is where we would look for cognitive engagement. We see the same pattern of effects. People previously rewarded are now completely disengaged from this task. Now, there's a lot of ramifications for this. We look in school places, for instance, at teacher behaviors. I'm going to tell you one old study that started many others. We were in a school system in Rochester, New York. We talked to all teachers in the summertime before they saw any of the students that were going to be assigned to them in their class. And we asked them about their strategies of motivation. I say, Frankie is a child in your class and he's been listless and uninvolved and not turning in his homework on time. What would you do with Frankie to motivate him? And some teachers would say I would give him rewards and gold stars when he turned in his stuff, but I would also let him know the consequences of not doing his work. I would keep him in from recess or whatever. They had strategies, but they would be reward and punishment strategies to control Frankie's behavior. And then other teachers would say, well, if Frankie's been uninvolved and listless, something's wrong with Frankie. I need to find out what's going on with Frankie. I need to find out from his perspective what's in the way of his motivation before I can know what to do. We called these latter teachers who took the frame of reference of the motivatee autonomy supportive teachers, and we called the other ones controlling teachers. And then we followed the children in their classroom over the next year. It was a longitudinal study. But this is just the correlations 5 weeks into the school year. By 5 weeks into the school year, if you were in a classroom of a teacher who tended to use rewards and punishments as a form of motivation, you're less curious about schoolwork. You're less wanting hard problems. In fact, you want easier problems to do. And you don't take any independent attempts at mastery. You just wait and do things when you're told to do it. You don't curiously investigate anything. And the opposite is true if you're in a classroom of an autonomy supportive teachers. In fact, our longitudinal data shows that you go both ways. Autonomy supportive teachers increasing curiosity and controlling teachers decreasing it. What's striking to me as a parent and also as a clinician is 5 weeks into the school year, controlling teachers were already having a negative effect on children's sense of cognitive competence. They felt less good as students. And they felt less good as people. They had lower self-esteem. These are major impacts in a very short period of time. So we might think this is just a phenomenon for children, but at the same time we were doing work in a Fortune 500 company. So we decided to give the same interview survey to the managers of branches in this company. And so instead of Frankie, we said Frank. You have an employee, Frank. Frank's been missing some deadlines lately. He doesn't seem as engaged in his work. What would you do with Frank? And we scored the managers in the same way we scored the teachers in terms of control and autonomy. And these are the relationships that we got in that Fortune 500 company between the manager's control orientation or autonomy orientation and employee attitudes. If you had an autonomy supportive manager, you had more satisfaction with your supervision, a lot more sense of empowerment, of course, because that person's listening to you and cares about your voice. You were more this was really interesting to the company, they were much more satisfied with their current level of pay and benefits, whereas the ones who worked for controlling managers were dissatisfied with their current level of pay and benefits. And of course, this is true of all of us. If we're going to work in a place we don't enjoy and we're not engaged in, we want to get paid for doing so. That's the meaning of that result. And there was a lot less trust in the corporation if you had a controlling manager. Overall job satisfaction as well. So it's not just a phenomenon for kids, it's for all of us, because nobody likes to work under control. We look at this in sport domains. This was a study that I was able to do with Kimberly Bartholomew and others in England in around 2011, 2010. We were looking at athletes from club level all the way up to elite level in England, and we looked at the controlling versus autonomy supportive style of coaches. And if you have an autonomy supportive coach, you have higher relatedness with your team, higher feelings of competence, higher sense of autonomy for the sport, and that's associated with more positive affect and less burnout. And the opposite is true of controlling coaches. And with the elite athletes, before they went to practice, we took a mouth swab. We took just a Q-tip and took a swab from the inside of their mouth so we could do an assay on secretory immunoglobulin A. And this is a protein, or it's an immunoglobulin that you secrete in the mucosa when you're under stress. And what we found is that those athletes who were under the leadership of a controlling coach were showing a lot more of this protein before they went to practices or scrimmages, showing the need-thwarting tendency of controlling coaches. Now, intrinsic motivation is not just about these serious situations like sport and school and work. It's also about things like video games. I've been interested in video games for some years now because people are very intrinsically motivated to play video games. But why? Because video game designers have already caught on to the idea if you give people a lot of autonomy and choice in games, if you give people a lot of positive feedback in games, make things very masterable for people in games, if you create lots of opportunities for connecting with other players, these things will all boost engagement in games. And we wonder sometimes why our children might be more engaged in video games than they are in school. It's because the designers of video games care a lot about the motivational things that will pull people in to engage them. And sometimes we're not caring enough about those in our work and our school atmospheres. In our company, Immersive, we do a lot of consulting with game companies, and part of that is we've learned a lot about the motivational techniques that really work. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're taking those techniques we see in interactive technology and then applying them in business organizations. I'm not going to go into research on this because I'm running short on time. Because I want to talk about extrinsic motivation, which is perhaps even more important for those of us who are adults. Children spend a lot of their time being intrinsically motivated in early years. We adults spend a lot smaller percentage of our time. Most of the time we're doing behaviors that we think are getting some separable outcome. We're not doing them for their own sake. We're trying to do something in order to get some other consequence. For instance, you might be sitting in this room now. It might not be that fun, might not be that engaging, but what it might be is you might think, well, maybe I'll get something useful out of this. That would be extrinsically motivated. And there are many forms of extrinsic motivation. The one I've been talking about so far is when you're extrinsically motivated because somebody else is controlling you with rewards and punishments. And this is, as I said, a strong form of motivation, but the problem with this form of motivation is it lasts only as long as somebody's got the reward in front of you or the stick behind you. As soon as those are removed, this motivation stops. So we say it has no maintenance and no transfer. And this is something where both our theory and behaviorists agree. They also say there's no maintenance and transfer. If you're going to control an organism, you have to keep the reinforcement contingency in place. We just say there's other ways to keep motivation in place. That's through internalization. Now, one form of internalization is what we call introjection. Introjection is now not when the environment is rewarding and punishing you, but you're rewarding and punishing yourself. You'll do it because you'll feel guilty if you don't do it. or you'll feel proud when you do it well. This is a very high powering motivation. If your parents have made their love of you contingent on your doing well in school, and then you become a student, you'll be driven to do well in school, because if you don't do well, you'll feel bad about yourself. You won't feel like a good person, and when you do well, you feel like, oh yes, I'm proud, I'm great. And this is ego involvement, a very, very strong form of motivation, but it's still controlled because you're pushing yourself. One part of you is pushing another part of you around. It's also very fragile because people who are highly introjected, when they experience any serial failures, they're very likely to either get depressed or they're likely to get disengaged. Still more autonomous, this is kind of a continuum of autonomy here, more autonomous is the idea that we can be identified with something that's not fun or interesting. We do something, maybe I'm collecting money for a cause in my neighborhood. There's nothing intrinsically motivating about the activity of collecting money from my neighbors. But I very much believe in the cause. And so I'm very volitional and autonomous and engaged in doing this activity because of the value I see in it, not because it's fun in its own right. And even the most highly autonomous form of extrinsic motivation is what we call integration, and that's when you're identified with a particular activity and that activity also fits with your other values. So people can vary in the relative autonomy of their extrinsic motivation, and this makes a great deal of difference to their work. And I'm just going to show a couple examples. This is a study that was done in Japan by Yamauchi and Tanaka. Many people said that this theory wouldn't apply in Japan because autonomy is not important in Japan, but of course that was really about independence, not autonomy. And you see here that here he asks elementary school children, why do you do your schoolwork? And what you can see here is that those who are externally regulated have very little value for school. It's not related to value for school, but those who are identified have high value for school. They don't avoid work, whereas those who are externally regulated, maybe their parents are putting pressure on them to do their schoolwork or whatever, those are work avoidant. And most important for our purposes here, the students who are more autonomous are more deeply processing the material that they get in school, where those who are doing it because of external controls or introjected control are only superficially processing what they're doing. They're just trying to get to the end. And this is the main characteristic of being controlled, is you take the shortest route to the end. This is why people exercise. So Martin Standage asked a series of adults in Great Britain, why do you exercise? And people answer, for instance, external regulation may be my doctor told me to. Introjected might be I feel better about myself when I do. Identified might be that I see the value in exercise. And intrinsic would be something like I find exercise fun. I don't understand those people, but there are some people who do find exercise fun. And then he had people wear an Act-A-Heart device over the next week. And the Act-A-Heart device measures whether they actually exercise and how much intensity in that exercise there was. And what you can see here is that controlled motivations didn't reliably predict them actually exercising. Only really understanding the value of exercise or finding fun of it were the only things that really got people up and moving. This is a work example, and it comes from a recent study by Guntert, and it was done in the Swiss insurance industry. And here, what's measured is the various motives people have for their work. And you can see here that job satisfaction is highly associated with feeling autonomous motivation at work. And it's negatively associated with feeling externally regulated, that you're doing it for the money. And turnover intention follows the same pattern. People who are autonomously engaged in their work don't have high turnover intentions. Those who are doing it for external regulation reasons do. And in terms of civic virtue and altruism within the organization, you see again that those are associated with the autonomous forms of motivation. So there's lots of good things about being autonomously motivated. It leads to greater engagement, better performance, better well-being, more vitality and energy, which I haven't shown here, but we have lots of evidence on that. So we want to think about how can we promote that intrinsic motive, that more autonomous form of motivation. How can we move people over to the right-hand side of this continuum? And we go back to our bird's eye view of the theory here. We say you do that by enhancing their feelings of autonomy, by enhancing their feelings of relatedness, and enhancing their feelings of competence. Now I want to say some specifics about what that looks like. What does an autonomy supportive leader, parent, or teacher look like? The fundamental issue is taking the other person's frame of reference. The bedrock way we support others' autonomy is first understanding their point of view on a situation. If I'm going to ask one of my employees to do some arduous task, I want to know how are they reacting to it and what's their perspective on the doing of it. What obstacles do they see? I want to appreciate what it means for them to be put in this position of motivation. Similarly, I want to encourage them to be reflective about it, to take interest in what's going on, and so for them to be aware of what's going on in their own motivational engagement. I want to give them as many choices as possible in terms of how they go about their task or how long they take at the task, as long as that's not something that's already constrained. And if I must constrain this, which is often the case in organizations, especially in our industry in immersive, we have very strong deadlines. Our deadlines are, technology companies want things to yesterday. If they give you a new assignment, they say, I want that by Friday. And you have to have it if you want to keep your customers. So we have a lot of strong demands. So if I'm going to make strong demands on my employees, I also need to give them a good reason why we have to meet these demands. Nobody can be autonomously engaged in something unless they have a good reason for doing so. And so giving a reason, sharing with them the pressures, sharing with them the issues that are going on so they can be on the team and in purpose with us as a team, that really helps engage autonomy. And I can't tell you how many organizational consultations I've been in where managers or leaders or teachers tell people what to do and never tell them why or why it's important or what it means. There was a recent survey in the United States that showed that 44% of employees of major US corporations didn't know what their companies made. Didn't know what they made, which tells you how little they've been explained. What's the purpose of your role and where you're going and what you're doing in your work? Hard to be autonomous. And then, of course, minimizing the use of controlling language and rewards. Also, we want to be competence supportive. And how do we be competence supportive? We're competence supportive by designing activities, job activities, school activities, sport activities, that people can feel dominant mastery in. We want to enhance that feeling of competence if we want people to autonomously get on board. And that means when they have a struggle or have difficulties, we're scaffolding and providing skill development so that they can feel that growth and engagement and mastery. We don't want people challenged all the time. We want them mostly always feeling they know what they're doing. And when they don't know what they're doing or something goes wrong, the feedback is not critical, harsh, or humiliating. It's instead informational. It's something that helps you know how to do it better from here. It's not critical at all. And if there's praise, it's not praise on how smart or how skilled you are. It's how well you did that thing or how much effort you put into that activity. It's focused on specific accomplishments and efforts rather than social comparisons, which raise all kinds of negative extrinsic issues. And finally, good leaders also promote relatedness. And I say this is the cheapest motivational intervention any organization can have, but it's nonetheless essential. To have relatedness in an organization means you're conveying respect for every individual in the organization. You're letting them all feel like they're significant. You're showing when they run into trouble, not criticism and anger, but care, concern, and helpfulness. And you offer many people opportunities to give because being able to give and contribute is something that actually binds you more to your organization and to its purposes than one might think. And I put up here this item that we use when we're measuring people's motivation. It's one of the most predictive items of people being engaged in a workplace or a school place. And the item is, my manager likes me. Notice that it's not, I like my manager, it's my manager likes me. It's that the manager has taken the time to convey that you're important, you're significant, and you're meaningful in this organization. It might be as little as a smile when you come in the door. And this is why I say it's the cheapest motivational intervention going. But an employee who is smiled at and knows that he or she is appreciated by a manager is much more likely to want to do what that manager and what that organization needs to be done. And we forget this so many times about that human motivation. So just a couple examples of why this is how these things work. How much time do I have? 5, 10? Where's my, okay. So we just finished a study that was 23 countries wide. We were asking students to describe the most motivating teacher they ever had. the most demotivating teacher they ever had. And these were open-ended essays. And then an essay about their current teacher. And across these countries, we counterbalanced the order of these essays so there wasn't order effects. And they were all done in their native languages, and they were all coded by people who were indigenous to the countries. And we were looking for what are the themes of the most motivating teachers across the world. And there were striking findings on this because in all, it says here, in every sample, there was 23 countries, in every sample, the most salient characteristics of a motivating teacher was that that teacher was autonomy, supportive, and relatedness. So students said things like, well, we had the teacher did things that really interested us, took concern with what we wanted to do, let us have inputs into the classroom, cared about us a lot. In almost no setting did students mention grades, rigor, structure, other kinds of things that we as adults are all concerned about in schools as what made them motivated in that classroom. Because they're thinking about the human end of motivation, which is really the most important end that got them engaged in the first place. And for demotivating teachers, you see that these are the things that are really missing. It was always the critical, controlling teachers that were the worst teachers that one ever had. In the medical sphere, we look at the same thing. We can look at doctors and how they treat patients. This is a study of people complying with medications. We had about 100 people with a chronic disease. They went in for a prescription from their doctor, and then they came out and they were interviewed about whether the doctor was autonomy supportive, or they were surveyed about whether the doctor was autonomy supportive or controlling in the prescription interview. And then we followed whether they actually took the prescription as prescribed. And there were several ways of doing this, but one way it says up there, 2-day pill count. That means that we called these patients on the phone 2 days after they got the prescription. We said, could you bring the pills to the phone? We want to make sure you have the right amount. And then they poured them out, and we said, count the number of pills. And we looked at how many pills were there compared to how many should be there. And we did the same thing 2 weeks later, again, unexpectedly to the patients, to look at how accurate they were in taking medications. And you can see that if they had an autonomy supportive physician, they were more likely to have an accurate pill count on those days. And they were especially more likely if they had autonomous regulation, if they had autonomous reasons for engaging in the pill taking. In fact, it predicted over 50% of the variance in this very simple prescription taking behavior. So we use this in terms of interventions in mental health, and we've had randomized controlled trials in many different areas. We've done randomized controlled trials on smoking, physical activity, weight loss, showing in the gold standard of the medical literature that autonomy supportive techniques really work to increase people's adherence and compliance to medical regimens. In the work environment, we apply a very similar model. Our idea is that the central things we're concerned with in the work environment are, I'm going to try this thing. No? Oh, there it is. This are the development of autonomous work motivation and need satisfaction at work. And many things contribute to this: job design, the challenges in the job, the sense of choice and voice in work, goal clarity, the nature of the pay scheme, what contingencies are there, the kind of relatedness in the organization. These things will all predict this. And another major issue is the leadership style, the managerial climate. And when you get high degrees of autonomous work motivation and need satisfaction, you get more performance and organizational citizenship, better well-being, more trust in the company, and higher job satisfaction. And we've done this in many, many studies. This is one of our earliest studies. It was with stockbrokers on Wall Street. These are people who made a great deal of money, and people would say, oh, they don't care about their work environment, they just want to make money. But that's not true. Stockbrokers are just like the rest of us, even if they make a lot more. What we showed there is that their experience of autonomy support from their manager had a big deal of predictive value for their need satisfaction at work. And if they were highly need satisfied in terms of these basic human needs, they performed better. They actually made more profits for their company, and they had higher well-being and mental health. This is a recent study Jeff Williams and others led here in 4 diverse Nordic companies. And Jeff Williams is a physician. He's really interested in somatic burden, the somatic symptoms people develop from stress. And his argument was that controlling managers lead people to be stressed, and that leads to absenteeism on the job. And what the data show, I'm going to show the path model for this, if I can. Oh, there it goes. You can see, oops. You can see that managerial needs support leads to more autonomous self-regulation that reduces the symptom burden, meaning there's less headaches, less stomach aches, less backaches, less symptoms of stress, and that reduces the absenteeism, which is a costly issue for corporations. It also, autonomous regulation reduces turnover and tension and emotional exhaustion at work, what we call burnout. So we've done a lot of interventions in companies, and I'm just going to mention one briefly here. This was with a Fortune 500 company. We do a lot of interventions through our corporation, but those are proprietary information. These are the ones that have been published in the literature, and there's others that are on the SDT website. This was just an early one. This is with a company where there was a lot of seemingly disengaged employees, and so we did a number of things looking at what might lead them to be more engaged. But in some branches of the organization, we did an intervention with the managers to get them to be more autonomy supportive. We gave them training in terms of acknowledging subordinates' feelings and perspectives, in terms of how to give feedback that was constructive and informational as opposed to critical, and how to facilitate motivation by giving more choice and latitude in the workplace. And what we found is, first of all, that the intervention worked. Over a short period of time, managers became more autonomy supportive compared to the ones who were in control branches. But the company did not want us to assess the outcomes. They said we do that ourselves whenever we have interventions. So their HR division assessed for the outcomes in the employees. And what they reported to us is that in the branches where we had done an intervention, there was much higher job satisfaction. There was greater trust in the corporation, and they were quite happy with the fact that now in those branches, these people were satisfied with their current level of pay and benefits. They wanted us to go into more branches as a function of that. So I'm going to end on one final note here. I had a couple other themes, but I'm going to go just to the issue of well-being. Part of my argument has been that the very conditions that promote volition and engagement and intrinsic and highly autonomous extrinsic motivation are also the conditions that lead us to feel well as people. They have higher subjective well-being, more happiness, and to have less somatic symptoms, etc. Whoops. And there's a lot of data on this worldwide. So we collect data around countries. And if you just look at basic need satisfactions, they're highly correlated with indices of well-being, not just in ours, but in everyone else's research these days. But most of us are not so interested in how one country compares to another or one person compares to another. We're interested in what makes us go up and down in terms of our well-being from day to day. So I might be having a really poor day today because of my jet lag and my anxiety about speaking here. So my well-being might be low, but you might be high because you fell in love with someone this weekend, and it doesn't matter what I'm saying, you're still happy today. There's rises and falls in every one of our well-being, and we say that those rises and falls are primarily determined by the changes in our basic need satisfactions, by day-to-day variations in how much autonomy, how much competence, and how much relatedness that we feel, which is really affected by our workplace lives. But first I'm going to show you one example with students. These are students from my University of Rochester. And this is their positive and negative affect traced across the week. And you see a pattern here, which is on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. They have a kind of moderate positive affect. And on Friday afternoon, really, it starts to shoot up. And it stays high across the weekend. And then on Sunday evenings, it starts to go down. We trace these things multiple times a day, and you can see that there's some trend there. So something's going on in this trend that we don't understand, and we need more science to really look at. But we think weekends have something to do with it. And the same is true for negative affect. But if you look at weekends, why are weekends high? It's not because students at my university, which is a very high-pressure university, are not studying and not working. In fact, they report a lot of hours of work on weekends. They're working where they want to. They're working with the strategies they want to. They're sitting with the people that they like. They're around, they are affiliating with the people that they love. Sometimes they're going home and they're with their families, so relatedness goes up. And what you see is on weekends, you have this peak in autonomy and this peak in relatedness, whereas competence is staying pretty even across the week. And those two rises in autonomy and relatedness need satisfactions are accounting for the rise in well-being on the weekends. So we went then to a study of American workers, and this is a heterogeneous sample of Americans who are full-time workers. Most of whom are working Monday through Friday. And what we see here is that on days When they have more, these are we tap them 3 times a day at random intervals. At moments when they're feeling more autonomy, they have more positive affect. They have less negative affect. They have more energy and vitality, and they have fewer of these physical symptoms like headaches and stomach aches and other issues. And the same is true for relatedness. Has the same impact on all of these things, and competence on everything but the symptom picture. And then we got interested, well, why does this have a same weekend effect? And there's a huge weekend contrast in American workers. They're much happier on the weekends. They have more positive affect, less negative affect, fewer physical symptoms. It's funny how people don't get sick on the weekends. But we have to wonder why that is. But if you look at the work contrast here, you can see that there's for most of these workers, there's much lower autonomy and much lower relatedness in the workplace than in the other parts of their life. Now, interestingly, if you have a worker who has a lot of autonomy on her job, or a worker who feels a lot of relatedness on his job, those people don't show this big weekend effect. It's the people who can't find autonomy in their jobs and the people who don't feel relatedness to their coworkers that are showing this waiting for the weekend effect, because they're not getting needs satisfied during the week. But this is not necessary in a work environment. Work environments can be designed to be really need satisfying, and then people can actually have well-being across the week without such a contrast and without waiting to get out of work. Well, I was going to talk about a few more things here, but I think I will. Well, I don't think I'm going to click anything here. There we go. I'm going to instead sum up here somehow, because I'm not going to have time for these things. Let me go on here. Put my final slide up here. There it is, summary. Summary, it's a good thing to get your needs satisfied. It's good to be in an environment where people are supporting your basic psychological need satisfactions, because this leads you to be more engaged, to be more motivated, to learn more, to perform better. And this is true across the lifespan. It's true across cultures. And it's true in every setting that we have been able to investigate, which is why we call them universal and basic psychological needs. And we so often forget them as the fundamental tools of motivation. And these are the things that make people flourish. And that's why we need to pay a lot of attention to them in any setting that we're in. Thank you very much.
We are happy because you are here, so that makes us happy. So
I'm happy because I'm done.
So thank you so much. So we take 2 questions. So who's the first?
I was so done, I was already taking my microphone off and running. So. I'm not intrinsically motivated to give speeches. I do it only because it's autonomously, extrinsically motivated and introjected. It's highly introjected as well. So,
you did a great job, thank you. Regarding praise, what would be your take on the authenticity of praise?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because when we're being inauthentic in praising someone else, it's because we're trying to control them or manipulate them. And people are very sensitive to this. This is probably why we have the gender effect in praise studies, is because women know that sometimes praise is directed for the wrong reasons at them. But in more generally, we all know that sometimes people are praising us because they're trying to get us to do something. And to the degree that we sense that it's a controlling force on us, then it's actually undermining rather than enhancing. So praise has to be authentic. And then I also would add that it needs to, partly what makes it authentic is it's specific. You're not praising somebody in some general terms like what a smart guy you are, but rather, it's really cool what you did right here. Or this thing that you did was pretty innovative. Those specific kinds of praises actually feel authentic because they connect with something you've actually done. So we say that, if you have done something, it should connect with the efficacy that you or yourself were experiencing. So I think it's a very good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Second question, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a very practical question.
Sure.
How easy do you think it is for teachers or managers with their students or their employees to learn better ways of motivating?
Yeah. Everybody hear that? The question was, how is it easy for people to learn how to be better motivating? I think it's easier than we think. I've done a lot of interventions in schools and a lot of workshops with parents and a lot of organizational interventions. And first of all, I would note that almost everybody, when they're thinking about their own life, agrees with this. Every manager I've ever worked with wants to feel autonomy as a manager, wants to feel relatedness as a manager, wants to feel competence as a manager. And when they look at that and they think, yeah, I need those supports myself, it helps them see I need to do that for my subordinates as well. When I do workshops with teachers, we always start the same way. We ask them about their own autonomy and their own competence and their own relatedness. And when they get the feel for how important it is in their own lives, then we can talk about why it's important in the classroom. And so similarly with parents, it's always the same, which is as human beings, we know these things to be true. It's just that they're so easy to forget under the kind of pressures, and particularly outcome pressures, that many of us are under in our organizations. Teachers who are under the pressure of high-stakes testing, for instance, are often so concerned with getting the score output from their students that they forget about the motivational components. And managers who are under pressure from upper managers who are also controlling to get certain outcomes, and employees will use controlling techniques with those employees. So I think the hardest part is not that people can't change in these directions. It's also helping organizations become more sensitive to these needs and creating the conditions under which they can occur. People can be trained. Organizations need to be structured so that people can carry out these techniques.
My praise comes from the bottom of my heart. It's really authentic. So it was more than pretty cool what you did. It was great.
Oh,
thank you very much.
She's going to undermine my motivation now. Thank you very much. Thank you.